Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's show. I have a real special guest for you today. My guest for you today is Dr. Tanisha Ranger. She's a licensed psychologist in the Las Vegas Valley area. She's the private practice owner of Insight to Action that provides both clinical therapy and consultation services. Her specialty is sexual addiction. She's also specializes in working with couples and uses motivational interviewing and acceptance and commitment therapy. And one other specialty that she also has is working with folks who struggle with insomnia. She specializes in working with folks who want to overcome trauma, manage their relationships, improve moods, and embrace themselves. And today she's going to be discussing a very sensitive topic, but one that I hadn't thought of. And it was just kind of one of those spontaneous interviews where she and I had planned to actually talk about an entirely different topic. And then she talked about her experience in working with military folks who have experienced sexual trauma and may or may not be aware that they've experienced sexual trauma while in the military, and how this impacts their mood and how she helps them work through this. And she also talks about how this is something that's been going on in the military, not just for women, but for both men and women in the military, and how it's kind of a dirty little secret. And so she's going to give us some golden nuggets and really just open our eyes to some of the things that we may not have thought about or may not have been aware of or privy to with folks who are in the military and work very diligently to serve our country. So, without further ado, here is Dr. Ranger. Hello, Tanisha. Welcome to the show. I'm so happy to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
I know we've got,
but I'm here because I think I've listened to your podcast and I think it's really useful and good to get information out there to people.
So. All right. Well, thank you so much. Yes, thank you for that. I appreciate that. And so, just so our listeners can become a little bit familiar with you and know a little bit about you, tell us about you and the work that you do.
Okay. The work that I currently do is mostly with veterans. I worked at the VA. I'm a licensed psychologist, and I've been a therapist for probably over 15 years at this point. And so currently I work full-time at the VA, and I treat just the whole gamut of mental health concerns, anxiety, PTSD, depression, interpersonal stuff. I do couples work through the VA as well. And on the side, I have a small private practice that I do therapy, I do assessment, I do consultation, I do all kinds of great stuff. Oh, and clinical supervision.
Oh, that's great. Wow. So you wear a lot of different hats.
All the hats. Yes.
And yes, so you work with veterans, and working with veterans, I know, can be difficult in the sense that they have what's called complex post-traumatic stress.
Yes.
And for our listeners, and I know this deviates a little bit from what we're going to talk about, are you able to tell us a little bit about what complex post-traumatic stress disorder is?
Well, I mean, complex post-traumatic stress disorder usually results from having repeated exposure to traumatic events and on top of that, other stuff. So like with veterans, what makes it complex is the fact that, you know, a lot of the combat-related PTSD also includes feelings of guilt and shame and remorse, and there's a lot of self-loathing on top of the trauma of actually being in war. For the others who have non-combat related trauma, specifically I work a lot with people who have military sexual trauma, it becomes complicated because now you're in a position where you are, you know, either sexually assaulted, sexually harassed, sexually abused in some way, but you are also in a system that is kind of set up to protect the perpetrator. You know, and so there's so much that you have to consider. Do I tell because what retaliation is going to come back at me, but also will I have to give up my job? You know, this is their job.
When
You
you
know what I mean?
when you say the system is set up to protect the perpetrator, can you say a little bit more about that, what that means?
You know, there's been a lot of talk and a lot of controversy about that. Senator Kristen Gillibrand in New York has been forwarding this move to take specifically military sexual trauma cases, rape, assault, outside of the chain of command. Because right now, the way it works is, well, first of all, the flow chart is insane. The different people that you'd have to go through ever. But the real crux of the problem is that the people who are in charge are motivated to act like nothing happened. Because if you admit that there was a crime, you also admit that you weren't doing your job as the leader. And so it's really hard to get somebody to be like, I failed at my job and this thing happened to one of my soldiers, one of my service members. Mostly they're gonna act to protect themselves, you know. And so the system doesn't do anything to, the people who are your commander are not lawyers. They're not trained to say whether or not enough evidence exists to go to trial, but they're doing that. And they're doing it at the very early stages. And it doesn't often matter what was the thing that happened. And so you're in a position where, you know, you have this system where, first of all, you have to decide, do I want to deal with the fallout of telling? The fallout is often retaliation from the person, from their friends. People are ostracized by the rest of their squads and stuff like that. For women, it's complete nonsense what they have to go through, because on top of that, you know, all of the other women essentially have a choice. They can either stand by her and be harassed and berated like she is, or they have to turn their back, and it's really isolating. So then if you get to the point where you're like, you know, this is not acceptable, I'm going to tell, well, now you have another problem, because the guy you got to tell or the woman you have to tell would like to keep their rank, would like to advance further, don't want it to be known that they're letting terrible things happen on their watch. And so they're very, very motivated to squash it. You know, they often use phrasing like, I've heard, you know, it was just a mistake, you don't want to end someone's career over this, you know, like really hard pressed, like, you know what that's going to do to your career, you know, you're never going to be able to advance, things like that. The system is set up to make sure that people who are victimized just stay really silent about it.
And just out of curiosity, what's the demographic of the people that you work with that are going through something like this?
Trauma through the military?
Yeah, the complex PTSD that are like victims of this and having to go through this, I guess this form of silent suffering, if you call it, as you call it.
It's hard. It's a large proportion, and definitely more women than men.
Okay.
But a fair amount of men.
Really?
Yeah, in terms of harassment, a lot of the time, and different forms. So like military sexual trauma is not just about sex or rape. It's about sexual assault. It's about sexual harassment. Are people making comments about your body all day, every day? Are people trying, like there's people who have been just continually asked out over and over and over again, despite the fact that they're married, despite the fact that the other person is married. All that counts as military sexual trauma. I actually had one gentleman who he got into something with a superior who made it a point to, with his steel-toed boots, stomp on this man's genitals over and over and over. That is sexual trauma. That, you know, and the fallout from that has been horrific for him, you know. And so it's sexual trauma, military sexual trauma is a big thing. And so a lot of people fall under that umbrella. And a lot of people didn't necessarily realize, because when they started talking to me and I'm like, well, were you ever harassed? They were like, oh yeah, all the time. I'm like, how did that impact you? You know, I hated going to work every single day. There was nothing that I could do about it, you know, especially the women who worked in the male jobs like mechanics. Those women were particularly susceptible to being harassed in that way.
Wow. Do you find that there's a double standard with men versus women in the military who experience complex PTSD as a result of sexual trauma?
Probably in the military. I mean, most people are not seeking out treatment while they're in the military. That's a big thing. Because again, this is their livelihood. They don't want to be bothered with what it's going to entail, the possibility of losing their job. But when it comes to people actually knowing about it, people speaking up, there is a little bit of a double standard. There's almost the sort of acceptance that, you know, women are going to get raped. You know, that's probably going to happen. But there's this huge issue when it comes to the men who experience that kind of sexual assault, especially when they're young and just got in, because then, you know, there's the whole thing is set up to blame the victim. So to blame the male victim is to say he's weak, or he's, you know, he's gay, or he's this or he's that. And so it's a whole question of their manhood in its entirety. Whereas for the women, it seems like, well, part of being a woman is the like strong likelihood that you're probably going to get raped. Like, I mean, that's kind of the mentality that I hear coming from people. And, you know, one of the major things that they wish would have happened was somebody just listen to them, believe them, and then do something about it, you know, because oftentimes they get punished.
Wow. So that's really shocking to hear. And I'm curious, you said that they don't really come forward while they're in the military.
Right.
So while they're going through this in the military, how are they coping with this? What are they doing to kind of, you know, get through it or try to, you know, just maintain their own sanity?
All of the negative coping skills that you can think of. They're drinking, they're doing drugs, they're becoming aggressive and getting into fights a lot. They're slacking on their work. So, you know, what happens, I recently gave a talk with a colleague over at one of the Army bases to the social work interns who were, you know, they treat people on base. And what I said to them was like, listen, you'll probably not get someone tell that they were sexually, but if you notice that a person was really diligent and really conscientious and all of a sudden they're late all the time, they're getting reprimands, they're getting into trouble a lot, they're drinking a lot more, maybe they're doing drugs, maybe they're actually becoming very promiscuous and acting very like risky, dangerous behavior, it's important to explore that, because those kinds of coping activities that are, we all as the clinicians know, super defeats the purpose, but it's kind of the only outlet that they have, you know. And so rather than a person coming in and being like, I was sexually assaulted, what'll happen is they'll come in because, you know, their sergeant tells them that they need to get their anger under control. or they keep showing up to like drill, like still drunk from the night before. You know, that kind of thing. Like they cope in the least useful ways because, you know, it's very isolating. There's not a whole heck of a lot that they can do.
Wow. And and so when do they seek out help?
That can be hard. You know, I began this year seeing a woman who in her 60s maybe, and I'm the first person she ever told about having been raped while she was in the military. So it can absolutely vary. A lot of times, what I found is that most of the time, especially for the women, when sexual trauma has been a part of their experience, their career is cut short every time. You know, and it used to be that they would kind of drum them out on a medical discharge, diagnosing like borderline personality disorder, things of that nature,
And
so that they have to get rid of them.
when you say their career is cut short, can you tell me a little bit about what you mean by, like, what happens, or what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so each and every one of the people that I talk to, and I'm talking specifically about women for right now, they went into the military to be lifers. They wanted to do their 20 years or more. They wanted to advance. They were gung-ho. They wanted to do their jobs. They were absolutely psyched about it.
Sure.
And then the thing happens, and then something changes. So if they don't speak up about it and they start coping in those negative ways, they get themselves into enough trouble that they get discharged. Or if they do speak up about it and the people that they're speaking up about don't like it, then there's a whole other problem that tends to arise. But what it usually comes down to is they end up leaving the military long before they had planned to. And sometimes they end up just being like, I'm done with this because I can't take it anymore. And they themselves elect to go. But every single one of them was like psyched to be in the military. They were going to serve their country. They were going to go there 20 some odd years, retire from the military. That didn't happen for most of them. For all of them, actually. Nope, that's not true. There are a couple who did actually make it their 20 years.
Is that
which is hard.
Yeah, and is it the same case for the men too, where their careers are also cut short? Do you feel like they're also impacted in that way?
Yeah. No, I think it's not as prevalent, but it does happen where, you know, when something like that happens to the men, they usually become more aggressive and angry. They're the ones that turn to alcohol a lot. Then they get a DUI. Then they, you know, or they end up like beating someone up at a bar, and they do like those kinds of things that gets them, you know, discharged from the military earlier than they would like.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So that sounds really serious.
Yeah, it's rough. It's really rough. And there's not enough being done about it.
It sounds like it, and it sounds like it's one of those things that's you know, don't ask, don't tell type of thing. It's got that kind of feel to it, where it's like one of those ugly secrets. I'm curious, do you just see the victims of the assault, or do you also see people who also perpetrate that as well?
So here's the thing. So if a perpetrator actually like gets punished and they get like court-martialed, they get dishonorably discharged, no. The VA doesn't treat people who are dishonorably discharged.
Okay.
However, if they never faced any real consequence for it, the likelihood that they're going to bring it up in therapy is really slim. So I could be treating a lot of perpetrators and not know about it.
Sure.
And, you know, and I wonder sometimes when I'm treating someone for an extended amount of time and it seems like their symptoms are not abating in any way. I wonder, like, are you telling me everything?
When you say that, what do you mean? When you say their symptoms are not abating, what do you mean by that?
When I can see that someone has that sort of pervasive shame, guilt, remorse, that kind of thing, and the work that we're doing is not helping at all, it makes me wonder, what if they're not telling me everything? Because shame would be a big part of, you know, coming out of the military, knowing that you'd done something like that, knowing that you'd been sort of instrumental in the ending of another service member's career, or many, depending on how many people you've assaulted. But you wouldn't want to say that. And so that wall stays up. And so that, you know, being seen and accepted is never going to happen. And so it's always kind of superficial work. These are the ones that I find a lot of the time that just keep saying, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? And I'm like, how about if you just be? Which is unacceptable to them.
And it's very interesting that you say that, because I also work with criminal offenders, and I have to agree with you when they say that they're the victims, but again, that wall is not coming down, and it's just like, okay, and it's, you have a really difficult time seeing what exactly are they the victim of, right? And it's kind of like where they're pointing the finger at everyone else and saying that they did this to me, but it's not really clear that something, what happened, and it becomes more and more prevalent that you seem to be the perpetrator. And you know, kind of going along with that, you've also said that you call yourself a narcissist whisperer.
Well, it was a title that was bestowed upon me at my old job.
Tell me about that.
So I am currently, I'm a certified sex addiction therapist.
Okay.
And I worked for 6 years in a residential treatment facility, specifically treating sex addiction and trauma. And what started to happen was that our most difficult clients would come in and they would be just a hot mess. And then I would get around them and then they would start acting right. And so my supervisors started to call me the narcissist whisperer, which did not bode well for my stress levels, because then they started assigning me all the narcissists. But, you know, because there was just a way that, I kind of approached treatment that somehow kind of broke through things for them. You know, they usually have that wall up. They usually are, you know, waiting for any particular reason to either idealize you or, you know, defame you, like you're just nothing. And I think there was this way in which I approached treatment where I'm not going to get into a power struggle with you, that seemed to put that stuff to the side. There was a level where it was so clear that I didn't care if they thought if they thought it was magic or if they thought I was evil. That what I really wanted to do was like, what we're not going to do here is waste time.
Yeah.
You spent a lot of money to come here. You want to do some work?
Exactly.
You know, and so there was just something about me. I don't know if maybe they weren't, you know how we get the lowered expectations thing. So maybe they weren't expecting me to know how to deal with stuff. Maybe they were expecting to be able to take advantage. I don't know what it is, but you know, I've had a lot of experience and a lot of time with narcissists that has helped me hone like my skills in working with them. Also, you know, I've worked with a lot of perpetrators. I've worked with a lot of people who have done some really heinous stuff, the kind of stuff where my friends are like, I don't know how you do that. And then I'm like, well, if I don't, they're just going to do it again. You know, and so helping them to be able to separate themselves from their behavior, like yourself, you're not the sum total of every terrible thing you've done. I can dislike that behavior. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're a bad person.
Right.
And I think that for a lot of them, they have been, you know, because you're coming into sex addiction treatment. This is residential. It's at least 30 days. Most people stay 6 weeks. You walk away from your whole life and you drop a couple grand. I mean, 20 grand.
Yeah.
That was when I was there. It's probably more expensive now. And you give up your autonomy to come and live in this place where strangers impose rules on you. Most of the time, those people have encountered a lot of folks who judge them really harshly. But when I'm not doing that, they don't really have any reason to be like, oh, you're stupid. No one cares about you. Because what I'm saying is, hey, I'm not okay with that stuff you've been doing, and my preference is for you to stop. So let's figure out how we can do that. And I think that I've gotten a lot of really good response from that. But I think mainly just not getting into power struggles, especially when I worked in residential, because I'm like, look, you can do the work or not do the work. You can address things or not address things. At the end of the day, I'm going to go home. And then I'll be back tomorrow. And if you want to work, then we can. But this is not something that is going to impact my life the way it's going to impact your life.
Correct.
Telling them that usually pisses them off in the beginning, and then they come to appreciate it, where it's just like, no, I'm not going to work harder than you on this.
So they have a come to Jesus moment.
They usually do. There was one where I caught him off guard, and so he didn't have the chance to develop a negative opinion of me before. He came in like a bat out of hell. He was just so offended, and just he was smarter than everyone, and he was very smart. And he had picked everyone off, and he was like, this person is that, and that person is this, and he was absolutely sure about everybody. And then I just showed up, and he was like, oh, I hadn't formed my opinion of you yet. And it was too late, because I'm lovable, so.
And as you're talking, because I work with victims and I work with perpetrators as well. And a lot of times in my work, I draw parallels between the two.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious, since you work with complex PTSD of sexual assault, and then you also work with people who also have sex addictions, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they are a perpetrator of sexual violence, but I know that you've also said that you work with people who have done some heinous things. And I don't know if that's sexually or not, but I'm curious, when you're working with your victims and you're working with these people who have done these heinous things, is there parallels that you've drawn between the two?
Yeah, there are some pretty good parallels between the two, and it's almost as if the victimhood and the perpetratorhood can stem from the same hurt.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense to you? Where I've treated a lot of people who have, sexually assaulted people, and I've treated people who have been sexually assaulted. And when I look at their family backgrounds, they look remarkably similar.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so they go either way.
Can you tell me about some of the similarities that you've seen?
Lots of rigid boundaries or excessive permissiveness in the family system, where it was like no one cared whether you came or went. I saw a lot of that contingency-based love, where it's like, you don't necessarily matter when you're just existing, but you get those good grades, you win that championship, you do something notable, and all of a sudden you get all the love in the world. And so you learn that acceptance and love and all of that stuff is something that you have to earn through deeds. And that can't end well when that's your state of mind. And so I've seen that kind of upbringing in both perpetrators and victims, where the household is one that's not safe. When I talk to people who, especially if they've had childhood abuse, and one of the things that I always hear is, I should have told. If I had said something, where they're trying to take responsibility, and the thing I have to say is like, hold on 1 second. Who would you have told? Who was going to hear that? What do you think would have been the outcome? And when they realize, like, children tell when it's safe to tell, and they don't tell when it's not, and they're very perceptive at knowing, whether it's I'm going to be blamed or punished, or, mom will have a meltdown and then I'll have to take care of her. Or, like whatever the case may be, or it's going to just be denied and I'm going to be called a liar. Whatever the case may be, children are usually really, really perceptive about whether or not the environment is safe to share things. And when it's not, stuff develops. And I think that I found like that unsafe childhood environment in both perpetrators and victims a lot, actually.
And as you're talking, I'm just kind of wondering, with the folks that have complex PTSD as a result of sexual abuse, when you work with these people, what are some of their ideas, or what are some of the things that develop around sex for them? And I'm also curious to know the same thing about the perpetrators of sexual violence. What are some of the ideas and things that develop around sex for them? What are some of their, I don't know, I guess their norms or their ideas or their expectations around that?
What I found, and I'm going to be gendered on this, what I found with women victims and men perpetrators is that they both have a similar idea about the value of women, where it feels like mostly the woman's role is as almost property or possession of the man. And so the women who are the victims often find themselves with thoughts around, I have to do this. Well, he did take me out, like things like that. And the men on the other side are like, well, you have to do this. And I mean, I paid, you know what I mean? And so like those kinds of similar mindsets around sex tend to flow between both the victim and the perpetrator. Just this notion of there not being a whole lot of space for autonomy for women. Now, when it comes to male victims and things like that, part of that has to do with, the way that we socialize boys to only show strength. They can never be perceived as weak. And so anytime there's an emotion that has been deemed a girl emotion, they can't express that. And so.
And what would that be? A girl emotion or a female emotion?
Sadness, hurt, disappointment, fear.
And so they associate that with being feminine or being soft.
Yeah.
They are a male victim.
Right. The only thing that is appropriate to express is anger.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And are those male victims of female perpetrators or male perpetrators, or both, or how does that work?
It's interesting because especially if we're talking about childhood, the male victims of female perpetrators, it takes them a really, really long time to recognize that they had been victimized.
I was wondering about that.
Yeah, because what I've found and what I've worked with, there's the notion that, being with an older woman is this thing that you should be, that means you're a stud kind of thing. And we see it all the time now when we keep hearing these stories about these female teachers who have victimized, younger boys. You get the comments like, oh, why weren't my teachers that hot? Or I wish that would happen to me. And just kind of really minimizing the actual trauma of what it means to be victimized in that way, to be groomed and then to be taken advantage of by someone who is supposed to be trustworthy.
Yeah.
And to then be like, oh no, I was a victim. Being a victim is not a male thing, so that won't do. And so even they sometimes try to hold up the bravado of, look at me, I could pull a grown woman when I was 13, 14 years old. And it's like, no.
Yeah.
And it's hard because they would have to face that. Then they would have to face all of their notions about men and women and relationships and what constitutes strength, what constitutes weakness. That's like a whole paradigm shift. A lot of people are just like not interested in that.
And it also, you reminded me of something I wanted to ask, is that when people come to you as a result of having the sexual trauma, do they know that they've been sexually abused? Do they have that insight and that awareness when they are coming to you, talking to you, or is that something you have to like pull out for them or identify for them that, hey, this was abuse?
Me when I'm treating the veterans,
Mm-hmm.
most of the time they know, but I think when it's not like you got beat up and raped, it's very easy for them to minimize. Much of what goes on in the military is about walking it off and manning up.
Shut up or shut up type of thing.
Yeah, all that stuff. I think it was one of my first days. I was sitting in on a session with another clinician when I first started the VA, and the guy who was the veteran was talking about something, and I said, "Oh, well, did you talk to a therapist about that?" And the look he gave me was hilarious. It was like, "What?" And he was like, "In the Marines,
Mm-hmm.
the rule is you don't go to medical until the bone is showing. So if I'm not bleeding, bloodied, broken, like clearly physically injured, and I go to medical, that's viewed as weakness. That's probably going to get you ridiculed. So imagine if the injury is completely invisible, like witnessing something horrific or, being harassed on a daily basis. They're not going to go. That's not how the culture has trained them. So for some of them, I do have to let them know that yes, that was harassment. That was military sexual trauma. That's under the umbrella. Because like the guy who got stomped on, that hadn't occurred to him. For the woman who was harassed on a day-to-day basis every single day, harassed by her fellow service members while she was just going about her life trying to do her job, it didn't occur to her that that was sexual trauma because they hadn't physically assaulted her.
Okay. And so I kind of want you, if I'm just a person and I don't have that awareness, and let's say I'm in the military or I'm wherever, tell me what acts constitute sexual abuse. Can you spit out some things for me that are sexually abusive that I might not be aware of if it's not like this, gang rape or something like that, something which would stand out in my mind and be violent, kind of like what I've seen on TV, and I'm just kind of going along and I may not necessarily be aware, or I might minimize what happened to me. Can you give some examples of that so that people who are listening may be like, okay, maybe I just missed the whole situation, but maybe she's right.
Yeah. So instances where it felt like there was a power dynamic. So it felt like, even if it was a peer who was the same age as you, but it felt like not going along with this was going to be bad for you. Whether it meant that they would talk about you and ostracize you or ridicule you or whatever, whenever it felt like there was a power dynamic when it came to something sexual and you went along in order to avoid a consequence, that's probably a situation that was abuse. If there's a situation where you feel like somebody really could have befriended you and were kind to you in a time and a place where other people weren't. So like say your home was really chaotic, but your football coach was really good to you. he took great care of you. He made sure, you know, when your alcoholic dad didn't give you money that for lunch, he made sure you ate. And then you feel like you owe them. You know, that's grooming, you know. And so being groomed is a way that the perpetrator gets the victim to share in the responsibility of the act being perpetrated on them, you know. And then, so what are some other examples? Anytime somebody touches you and you don't like it, and you say no or stop or don't do that, and they dismiss that, you're coming up on some situations where you could call that being sexually assaulted. Right now, there's a great big push to stop forcing children to hug adults that they don't want to hug, because what you're teaching them is that your bodily autonomy doesn't exist.
Yeah.
That is controlled by other people. And when you get that message early on, it becomes really hard to say no to people as time goes on, you know. And so instances where you're being groomed, and you may not know that you're being groomed, you know, when a kid comes from a place where it's a lot of trauma and a lot of chaos, and there's just like this lighthouse on this stormy sea, you know, they don't want to lose that. And oftentimes, most of the time, perpetrators are really good at sniffing out which kids are most vulnerable, you know. If when you were a child and you spent time with an adult who frequently made phrases like, don't tell your mom about this, even if it was something completely innocuous, like they took you out for ice cream when you weren't supposed to have ice cream, and they said, don't tell your mom, and you didn't, that was kind of the start of grooming. Wow. Pushing the boundary a little bit at a time, seeing if they can keep you silent, seeing if you'll acquiesce, and that kind of thing. This is how it starts.
So with people who are victimized in the military that you work with, do they have a history of being victimized also in their childhood or in other areas of their life as well? Do you find that it's like a, you know, multi-layered type of trauma where they've had this, or this has repeatedly happened to them?
For a lot of them, yes. A lot of them joined the military to get some sense of stability. A lot of them came out of really chaotic households. A lot of them had been, you know, victimized in some way or another before. Yeah. Had been abused in some way or another before. Yeah. And they went into the military seeking solace, you know, seeking predictability. Because if there's one thing the military is, it's relatively predictable. Yeah. You know where you're supposed to be, you know what you're supposed to do. All of your minutes of the day are accounted for. And so that offered a sense of safety and stability that they were looking for. But a lot didn't. A lot of them didn't have any kind of abuse necessarily. Many of them describe their childhood as very happy. I also take that with a grain of salt sometimes. Yeah. Especially when someone who struggles with addiction was like, my childhood was perfect.
Yes.
Because I feel like you told me you started drinking at 12. That's not a thing that happens when life is grand, you know, and just kind of getting them to let down the facade that, because they built that facade and they believe it, you know, but it's the thing that allows them to really shame themselves, because now they're like, look at you. Nothing even happened to you during your childhood. Why are you such a failure? Why can't you stop this? And just another form of shaming themselves.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's interesting.
It sounds like it. It sounds like it. And so, you know, it's very interesting. I'm curious too, you know, for people who are in this environment, to put up or shut up, don't ask, don't tell. If they're listening to you right now and they're trying to, you know, get along and keep their job and keep their sanity, and, you know, they may be hearing you right now, what are some ways that you would recommend them coping with this? Or coping in general, just what are some skills that you would recommend or some things that they could do to kind of just, yeah.
Yeah, that's a really hard one because being in the military doesn't afford you a whole lot of options, because if you take yourself over to medical to talk to someone about it, you risk being ridiculed and ostracized already.
Okay.
And that's my instinct is like, talk to a therapist, but that is usually not an option. So one of the things that I've heard is starting to be done is that therapists are coming out of their offices in the active duty realm where they're going out and they're talking to people, and they're making it so like, oh, this is just a thing that we're doing, but if a person needs to talk, they can talk without the stigma of having gone over to the office, right? I don't know how much that's been rolled out. I think that's really useful. And
Okay.
I'm not sure, one of the things that is really good and useful for people is support. And if they have someone, a friend, a bunkmate, someone who they trust to confide in them, because holding the secret by yourself is really, really stressful.
Yeah.
It makes everything else you have to do more difficult. But I've had some veterans who had, 2 or 3 people that they really could trust, that they told what happened and they told why they weren't going to tell. But those people were there for them and, helped protect them, like made sure they were never alone with that person, or made sure that, if anybody asked any questions, they would be there for them. Like, oh, she's late because, she was feeling sick this morning, she was throwing up and yada, yada, yada. Like, it kind of sucks that has to happen, but to know that you have some support is like, it's everything.
Okay. And would you recommend, that maybe they go off site and try to find therapy that's not within the military?
Yeah, if they can afford it. That's the other thing. When you're low rank, you don't make that much money. So yes, if you can afford to go off base and find yourself a therapist, find someone maybe who takes TRICARE, because that might be useful.
Yeah.
Or find someone who charges a sliding scale fee.
Okay.
Like here in Las Vegas, we have a huge veteran and military population. There are a lot of therapists in town who charge a reduced fee for military members. And find someone that can understand specifically trauma. Even better if they understand military culture.
Right.
But I try to do my part. I speak at conferences and I try to educate civilian clinicians. Like, here are some of the things that might be helpful when you're treating active duty service members or veterans who don't want to be affiliated with the government, because that happens a lot of the time. People don't go to the VA because they're tired of it. Like, they're sick of the federal government, and so they don't want to do it.
Right.
They don't want to have other information. They don't, there's all kinds of reasons why. And so there are lots and lots of people who do seek treatment outside of the system, and that in and of itself can be really, really useful. It's just a matter of, you can't really do that when you're on deployment. You can do it when you're stateside, but when you're on deployment, you're in the desert, where you're taking mortars, onto your small makeshift base. There's no, I'm going to go off base and see a therapist in like Saudi Arabia or something. It's harder when you're on deployment. But with our advancements in technology, when it comes to telehealth, that might be changing too.
Okay.
Lots of clinicians do, video therapy. They use Zoom. They use all kinds of things where you might be able to, if you get a decent internet connection, you could conceivably, see a therapist.
Okay.
That isn't affiliated with the military.
Okay.
problem, you know, still is that they're not sure what they're allowed to tell their therapist and what the therapist has to disclose to their superiors. And so that makes even going to the therapist like, oh, I don't know if I can trust you. Yeah, and it's a real tough spot for the therapist too, because like I want to be able to help this person, but there are actual like rules.
Yeah.
I have to disclose this or that.
Okay.
And that's hard.
I'm also wondering too, you know, are there some resources that you can suggest for people going through this? Are there like maybe books that you would recommend, or anything on YouTube, or anything that you would recommend for someone who's going through this or has complex PTSD as a result of sexual trauma? I mean, either in or out of the military?
So specifically for the military, and I don't have the exact name because I wasn't prepared to talk about this.
That's my fault. I take complete responsibility for that because I threw this at you.
there was a website that I want to say it's called Protect Our Service Members.
Okay.
Or Protect Our Soldiers.
Okay.
But that whole website is just full of testimonials, which are doozies about the things that some people have gone through with regards to military sexual trauma, but it also has a lot of resources. And it has a lot of information. What is that called? Protect Our something. Protect Our Heroes?
Okay.
Our Heroes.
Okay.
I might have to send that to you later.
Not a problem. I'm looking for it now. So Protect Our Heroes. How about any books on complex PTSD?
Well, I like the books that are by like Peter Levine, by Bessel van der Kolk, Bonnie Babnock. They write really good books about understanding PTSD, how it actually affects you, not just your mind, not just your mood, but also your body, which is really important.
Yeah.
Let's see. The most recent one that I've really I've started reading is The Body Keeps the Score.
Yes.
It's Bessel van der Kolk. And Peter Levine's one, I think it's called Waking the Tiger.
Yes.
I think that's what it's called. Where they're really explaining what does it mean? Because I come across that a lot too.
Okay.
People come into my office with diagnoses with a whole bunch of letters following them that they don't understand, that nobody's really totally explained. And so I spend a lot of time with psychoeducation, just being like, you know, here are the symptoms. Okay.
Okay.
Not everybody has every symptom, but these are the general symptoms. These are sort of the thought processes that go along with it.
Okay.
These are some of the ways that it impacts your relationships. This is how it impacts, you know, how you feel about yourself, and, you know, the reason why you're so harsh and critical with yourself, and how your anger at other people is often stemmed from the way that you're harsh and critical with yourself, and just really kind of helping people to understand what exactly is going on.
Amazing. And I'll make sure to put a link to that in our show notes. And thank you.
And RAIN is the other one. RAINN.
Okay.
Lots of resources for people who have struggled with rape or sexual assault. And that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I will definitely put that in the show notes. And Tanisha, how can people get in contact with you if they want to see you, talk to you, wave? Yeah. If they want to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
The best way is probably going to be through my website.
Okay.
So that's insighttoaction.net.
Okay.
That's the name of my private practice. And so you can send me direct emails through that.
Okay.
And I believe that they are protected emails.
Okay.
not 100% sure, so don't put like your social security number in there, but it's, that's usually the best way. I check email several times a day, which is probably pretty stress inducing. I shouldn't do that, but you know, through my website, I'm on Facebook, and the Facebook page is Insight to Action Psychotherapy is my practice page.
Good.
So if you wanted to message me on Facebook, that's fine as well. And I'll often there I post a whole lot about articles and things like that, and my blog posts that are aimed at helping people to like better understand their mental health and know, oh, I guess it's time for me to seek help, you know, kind of thing.
Yes,
Mhm.
that's great. And I can't wait to post it. I think the people are going to love it. Also, should people be looking for you or looking for some sort of project that you're working on? Are you going to be presenting or doing anything coming up?
I've submitted a couple of proposals to present at conferences.
Okay.
Haven't heard back yet.
Okay.
Those ones are going to be okay. So I came up with the idea of presenting for clinicians who are going to be treating African American women who have been victims of sexual trauma, helping to sort of nurture their sexuality. And because when that kind of thing happens, especially early on, it shapes the way that you think about yourself, like almost entirely. You know, when you start to feel like, oh, I guess I'm just, you know, something for somebody to use.
Yes.
It can be really, really hard to come out of that and really like gain agency over your own sexuality and just be like, no, I get to decide. My pleasure matters. That kind of stuff. We're not, you know, we're not generally taught that, but on top of that, when you've gone through that kind of trauma, it's really hard to get to that place. So that's my hope. That's what I hope to be presenting on. We'll see if they get accepted.
That sounds exciting. Wish I was there to see that, but I appreciate you coming on, and I thank you so much for going with it on the fly. I think this is a great topic, so thank you so much for coming on.
No problem.
Okay, thank you so much for listening to that episode. I thought that was a very enlightening episode, and I learned so much from Dr. Ranger today, and she's probably going to come back on the show. I'm hoping that she can come back on and actually discuss the topic that we had set up and prepared to talk about. But anyhow, let me know what your thoughts are on this show. Email me at adatewithdarkness.com, at adatewithdarkness@gmail.com. And I would love to hear what your thoughts are on this show. Also, please be sure to like, love, and share the podcast, and leave a review so other listeners, people that are intrigued by the show, can know what your thoughts are. So drop a positive review. Always love that. If you want to email me or, put it on the Facebook page or positive reviews, that's certainly welcome too. And I'd love to be able to give folks a shout out about that. And also, if you're interested in joining my Facebook community with other folks who have struggled with abusive and often dysfunctional relationships, please do come over and do that. I'll leave the link in the show notes, but it's a Date with Darkness group on Facebook. And so lots of folks over there asking interesting questions, and providing support to one another. As always, I so appreciate you sharing your time with me today. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening for this hour. And until next time, be well.